Scene 1 begins with the vast steppes and rugged mountains of Central Asia, stretching endlessly under the sky. A landscape that has for centuries been the stage of empires, migrations, and conflicts. The question of which lands China has taken from Central Asia, whether from Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, or Tajikistan, is not just a matter of historical curiosity, but one of borders, sovereignty, and geopolitics. The territories in question are often remote, high-altitude zones, places where nomadic herders once roamed freely, with little sense of modern state boundaries. Yet in the 20th and 21st centuries, these spaces became contested frontiers where national maps were redrawn, treaties signed under pressure, and long-standing disputes simmered between Beijing and the newly independent republics of the region. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the newly born Central Asian states found themselves facing not just the monumental task of state-building, but also the heavy shadow of a powerful neighbor to the east, China, which wasted no time in pressing historical claims that had been left unresolved during the Soviet era. Kazakhstan. The largest Central Asian state shares a vast 1,700-kilometer border with China, cutting across deserts, steppe, and mountain ranges. The legacy of border disputes here dates back to the 19th century, when the Russian Empire and the Qing dynasty clashed over the undefined frontiers of their realms. In the Soviet period, occasional skirmishes and disputes broke out, particularly in the 1960s, when Sino-Soviet relations reached a hostile phase. After 1991, Beijing quickly reopened the question of contested lands, particularly in regions like the Ili, Altai, and Tachang areas. In the mid-1990s, Kazakhstan agreed to treaties that handed over nearly 22% of the disputed territories to China, amounting to hundreds of square kilometers. Though Kazakh officials argued this was a pragmatic compromise to secure peaceful borders. Critics inside Kazakhstan have long complained that valuable pasture land, mountain passes, and even mineral-rich zones were effectively ceded. The quiet resentment simmers because many Kazakhs feel their young state conceded too much too early in exchange for Beijing's diplomatic recognition and promises of trade. Kyrgyzstan, a much smaller and more mountainous country, also found itself entangled in border disputes with China. In the early 1990s, Kyrgyz leaders signed a series of agreements that eventually ceded around 1,250 square kilometers of territory to Beijing. Much of this was in the remote glaciated valleys of the Tian Shan, areas that had long been disputed but little settled. For ordinary Kyrgyz citizens, however, these agreements were deeply controversial. In 2002, protests erupted in the southern region of Axi, where demonstrators opposed the government's decision to finalize land transfers to China. The protests were met with a violent crackdown, leaving several people dead, and the issue became a rallying cry for opposition movements that accused the government of betraying national interests. While the Kyrgyz leadership justified its decisions as necessary to avoid conflict with a much stronger neighbor, the public perception has often been that Kyrgyzstan's weak bargaining power and economic dependence left it vulnerable to Beijing's demands. Tajikistan, the poorest of the Central Asian republics, faced perhaps the most dramatic territorial concession. In 2011, Tajikistan's parliament ratified an agreement transferring about 1,100 square kilometers of land in the Pamir Mountains to China. The disputed area was in the high-altitude, sparsely populated regions near the Wakhan Corridor, a strategic zone connecting Central Asia, China, and Afghanistan. While Tajik officials framed this as a success, claiming they had managed to keep 96% of the disputed land and only gave up 4%, critics pointed out that the land included resource-rich mountains and important strategic routes. For a country that was emerging from a devastating civil war in the 1990s and dependent on Chinese investment for infrastructure and energy projects, the agreement looked less like a diplomatic win and more like a reluctant surrender. Today, many Tajiks still view that land transfer as a symbol of their country's fragile sovereignty and heavy reliance on Beijing's goodwill. These border adjustments in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, while often presented as peaceful settlements, illustrate a broader pattern of Chinese assertiveness. For Beijing, clarifying borders was a step towards stabilizing its western periphery, especially in the sensitive Xinjiang region, where ethnic unrest and separatist sentiments have long been a concern. By securing treaties with its Central Asian neighbors, China not only eliminated potential excuses for cross-border disputes, but also expanded its influence in the region. At the same time, the agreements underscored the asymmetry of power, a rising global giant negotiating with fragile states struggling to survive after the Soviet collapse. The land transfers may seem small on a global map, but for the local populations and nationalists in Central Asia, they represented humiliating losses of heritage and sovereignty. Asterisk beyond the numbers of square kilometers lost. There is also the symbolic dimension. In societies where collective memory and history weigh heavily, the idea that ancestral grazing lands or sacred mountains were handed over to a foreign power is deeply painful. In Kazakhstan, stories circulate about how traditional nomadic routes were suddenly cut off by the new boundary demarcations. In Kyrgyzstan, resentment lingers that the blood of protesters was spilled simply because ordinary people opposed losing their soil to China. In Tajikistan, nationalists argue that their country's leaders, desperate for financial assistance, bartered away territory that had belonged to the Tajik people for centuries. These grievances occasionally resurface in public debates, online discussions, and opposition politics, reminding governments that the memory of land concessions has not faded. Asterisk. Yet the governments of Central Asia continue to walk a fine line. On the one hand, they seek to reassure their populations that sovereignty is intact and that no further concessions are on the table. On the other, they rely heavily on China for economic lifelines, whether it is investment in infrastructure under the Belt and Road Initiative, loans to keep budgets afloat, or markets for oil, gas, and minerals. This dependence creates a climate where openly challenging Beijing is nearly impossible. Thus, while the land disputes may be considered settled in the eyes of international law, they remain unsettled in the hearts of many Central Asians. Asterisk in the end. The lands that China took whether from Kazakhstan's eastern borderlands, Kyrgyzstan's mountain valleys, or Tajikistan's Pamir plateaus are more than just lines on a map. They are symbols of the uneven power dynamics in Central Asia, where geography and history collide with modern geopolitics. For China, these gains secured strategic depth and stable borders. For the Central Asian states, they came at the cost of internal unrest, national resentment, and the lingering sense of having lost something irreplaceable. The stage is thus set for the deeper story of how these uneasy compromises continue to shape relations between Beijing and its western neighbors, and how the question of land always emotionally, always symbolic remains one of the most sensitive issues in Central Asia today. Asterisk seen to asterisk farther south. Tajikistan's Pamir Mountains tell a harsher story. Rugged, high altitude, and breathtaking, they are also strategic. For centuries, they stood as a barrier between empires. Yet in 2011, Tajikistan's leaders agreed to transfer more than 1,000 square kilometers of this remote but precious land to China. Officials declared it a diplomatic success, claiming they had saved the majority